The night is quiet enough that you can hear the settle of your own blanket, and that is exactly where I want you tonight. Somewhere warm, somewhere still, while I tell you about a kind of life that most people only meet in stories. Not the polished kind, the real one. Pull the covers up. Let your eyes soften. We are going somewhere cold and stone-walled together, and I promise to bring you back safely. Here is the truth we begin with. In the middle of the medieval world, a certain kind of man exists who is never named in any surviving record, who owns almost nothing, and who is hired for exactly one purpose: to end a powerful life in silence, and then to disappear before anyone can prove he was ever there. If he fails, there is no trial waiting for him. There is only a rope, or worse, and a crowd gathered to watch. His entire existence rests on a single unbroken moment of stillness, followed by a single unbroken moment of speed. That is the whole of his profession. Stillness, then speed, then nothing. Picture him for a moment, because he deserves to be seen as a person and not a shadow. He is crouched behind a low stone wall on the outer edge of a lord's courtyard somewhere in what is now northern France, sometime in the 1200s. His knees ache from the cold coming up through the packed earth. He has been in this position, barely moving, since before the moon rose. His hands are wrapped in strips of cloth, not for warmth, but so his fingers will not slip on the handle of the knife tucked against his ribs. He is not thinking about glory. He gave that idea up years ago, back when he still had a name people used in daylight. He's thinking about the third guard's footsteps and how they fall a half-second slower than the first two, and what that half-second might buy him. Somewhere inside the hall behind him a fire is still burning low, and someone he has never met and never will speak to is asleep in a bed he intends to reach before dawn touches the eastern wall. He does not know the man's face yet. He only knows the shape of the doorway, the number of steps to the stairs, and the fact that if this goes wrong, no one in the world will claim to have sent him. That is the part almost nobody tells you. We grow up picturing assassins as elegant, trained, almost supernatural. Hooded figures who move like smoke, who belong to secret brotherhoods with ancient codes and quiet honor. The kind of men who choose this life the way a knight chooses a sword. But history, when you actually sit with it, tells a very different story. It tells you about men and women who arrived at this work not through ambition, but through ruin. It tells you about a trade with no guild, no manual, no teacher waiting patiently in candlelight. It tells you about weapons that were stolen rather than forged, poisons that were guessed at rather than measured, and payments that were promised far more often than they were honoured. Scholars still debate how organised any of this truly was in a given region or century since. So little of it was ever written down on purpose. What survives comes sideways through court records, through chroniclers, through the frightened testimony of servants who saw something they were never meant to see. And what survives suggests a life so precarious, so lonely, and so far from the myth that the myth itself starts to feel like a kindness we invented afterwards, so the truth would not sit so heavily with us. Before we go further into that world together, I want to ask something small of you, because it genuinely helps this kind of storytelling keep reaching people who might need a quiet hour like this one. If you find yourself settling into these long real histories, consider following along and leaving the video a like before you drift further in. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal on this end. And if you have a moment before sleep takes you, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what first drew you to a story like this one. I read every word, even the ones left at 3 in the morning. Now let your shoulders drop again. Let's keep going. Because the man behind that low stone wall is not an exception, he is closer to the rule. Across the medieval world, from the hill towns of Italy to the river cities of the German lands, from the court intrigues of England to the fractured kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, people very much like him existed in the margins of nearly every noble household's worst nightmares. They were not born into this trade, almost none of them were, They arrived at it the way a river arrives at a low point in the land, pulled there by circumstances they did not choose. A soldier discharged after a war that no longer needed him. A servant accused of a theft he did not commit with nowhere left to go. A woman who had already lost everything a woman was permitted to lose in that century, and who found that desperation sharpens a person's usefulness to those with coin and grievances. These were not chosen ones. They were the leftover people of a brutal century, and the brutal century found a use for them. What we're going to spend the next several hours understanding together is not a legend. It is a life. The way it actually began for people like this. The absence of training, the improvised weapons, the broken promises of payment, the impossible task of reaching a guarded target, the loneliness that came from trusting no one, the theatrical horror waiting for anyone who failed, and the strange cold twist that even success rarely meant safety. We will walk through all of it slowly, the way it deserves. Somewhere in a courtyard in the dark in a century that has been gone for 800 years, a man is still counting a guard's footsteps, still waiting for his half-second. Let's go find out what happens to him and to all the others, like him one quiet part at a time. No one ever wakes up as a child imagining this particular future. That is worth sitting with for a moment. A blacksmith's son dreams of the forge. A farmer's daughter dreams of a good harvest, a healthy husband, a house that does not leak. But nowhere in the surviving record, not in a single chronicle or court testimony, does anyone describe a young person who set their sights on becoming a hired killer, the way another might set their sights on knighthood or the priesthood. This was never a calling. It was always a landing place, and the people who ended up there arrived from every direction at once, carried by the particular cruelty of a century that offered almost no soft place to fall. Think for a moment about how narrow the paths actually were for most people born into that world. If you were born with land or a title, or even a modest herd of animals to your name, you belonged to a different category of person entirely. One with recourse, one with lawyers of a kind, one with relatives who could be leaned on when trouble arrived. If you had a grievance against a rival house, a debt to collect through violence, or an enemy who had simply become inconvenient, you did not pick up a blade yourself. You sent for someone. That is a detail worth sitting with because it tells you something true about how power has always worked. The wealthy rarely commit the violence that serves them. They commission it. This has been true in stone castles, and it remains true today in glass towers, only the currency has changed. In the medieval world, the person commissioning the violence remained safely inside the walls of respectability, attending mass on schedule, receiving guests, being addressed by title. The violence itself was outsourced to someone the historical record barely bothered to remember. So who were the people actually doing this work? The honest answer is less romantic than any film has ever suggested, and more human. Many were former soldiers, men who had fought in one of the era's endless campaigns, and come home to find that the skills which made them useful in wartime made them frightening in peacetime. A man who has learned to kill efficiently under a banner does not simply forget that knowledge when the banner is put away. Some historians studying demobilized soldiers across medieval Europe have noted a consistent pattern that periods following major conflicts saw a rise in both organized banditry and this particular quieter trade, as men with no land, no trade guild membership, and no family waiting for them looked for any way to survive. The evidence remains incomplete on exact numbers, since almost nothing about this world was recorded with any care, but the pattern itself shows up again and again across regions and centuries, which suggests it was not incidental, it was structural. War kept producing the very people who would go on to do this work. Others came from an entirely different direction. Servants accused rightly or wrongly of theft from a noble household faced a punishment so severe, so disproportionate to the offence, that flight often seemed like the only rational choice. Once a person fled, once they existed outside the protection of any lord or guild or parish that would vouch for them, they entered a kind of permanent legal shadow. They could not easily marry. They could not easily hold honest work, since most trades required a guild's blessing and a guild required a good name. And a person with no good name and no legal protection was, whether they wanted it or not, exactly the kind of person a desperate client could approach without much fear of consequence. If something went wrong, if the arrangement was ever discovered, there was no family of standing to demand justice on their behalf. That absence of anyone who would ask questions was, in the coldest possible sense, part of what made a person suitable for this work. There is a detail here that surprises most people the first time they hear it, and it concerns women. We tend to imagine this entire world as exclusively male-cloaked and broad-shouldered, and in raw numbers it likely was. But surviving court records from several regions, including certain Italian city-states and portions of the German territories, describe women hired specifically for poisoning, precisely because a woman moving through a kitchen or a sick room drew far less suspicion than a strange man lurking near a noble's chambers. A woman bringing broth to a fevered household member was simply part of the ordinary texture of domestic life. No guard questioned her, no steward tracked her movements. Her very invisibility, the same invisibility that limited nearly every other opportunity available to her in that century, became in this sour and grim context a kind of professional advantage. It is a detail that says something uncomfortable and true about how thoroughly a society's blind spots can be turned into tools by people with nothing left to lose and very few other doors open to them. What almost none of these people shared, regardless of how they arrived at this life, was any kind of formal preparation. There was no guild you could join, no apprenticeship that led naturally toward this trade the way a boy might apprentice with a cooper or a tanner, and slowly learn the craft under a patient master's eye. This work existed entirely outside the guild system that structured nearly every other form of medieval labour, and that absence mattered enormously. Guilds regulated quality, set standards, protected reputations, and offered something like a support network when times were hard. A tanner who fell ill could sometimes rely on his guild for aid. A person in this shadow trade had nothing of the kind. If you were injured on a job, there was no brotherhood waiting to nurse you back to health. If you grew too old for the work, there was no pension, no younger apprentice ready to take over your clients out of respect for your years of service. You were entirely, permanently alone with whatever skill you had managed to piece together, and whatever luck had kept you breathing so far. This is where an honest uncertainty belongs in the story, because scholars still debate just how connected or unconnected this world of hired violence actually was across regions. Popular imagination loves the idea of a vast underground network, cities of thieves and killers with their own laws and hierarchies, something almost like a shadow kingdom running beneath the visible one. The truth, as best historians can reconstruct it from fragments of court records, private letters, and the occasional chronicler's aside, looks far more scattered and improvised than that. Most of these people appear to have worked in near total isolation, known perhaps to one intermediary, one contact who arranged the job and took a cut, but rarely part of anything resembling an organized guild of killers. The romantic vision of a brotherhood bound by code and secret signs seems to belong far more to later fiction than to the actual surviving evidence. What we find instead, again and again, is loneliness. Desperate people working alone, trusting almost no one, because trust itself was the single most dangerous thing they could afford. And perhaps that is the detail worth sitting with the longest before we move any further into this story. The people we are describing were not villains, in the way stories usually mean that word, twirling and self-aware in their wickedness. Nor were they heroes dressed in some misunderstood nobility. They were more often than not simply the people a brutal century had run out of other uses for. Soldiers with nowhere left to march. Servants with nowhere left to turn. Women whose only currency in that world happened to translate in the darkest possible way into a peculiar kind of professional usefulness. The wealthy who hired them slept in warm beds attended by name remembered in histories and family trees for generations. The people who did the actual killing were meant to vanish afterward, meant to leave no trace, meant to be forgotten so completely that even now, standing this far outside their century, we can barely reconstruct who most of them were at all. But a life like that does not simply begin with desperation and end there. It has to be lived day by day, decision by decision, and the way these people actually learned their trade without teachers, without guilds, without anyone to catch them when they fell, turns out to be one of the more quietly remarkable parts of this entire story. There is a particular kind of education that only comes from surviving your own mistakes, and that is exactly where we are headed next. There is a particular kind of learning that only happens when the cost of a mistake is your own life and it produces a very different student than any classroom ever could. No hesitation born of theory, no hedging, just the sharp, permanent correction that comes from having nearly died, and there's a quiet vow made somewhere in a dark alley or a cold stairwell never to make that exact error again. This is where we find the people we've been following once they had already arrived at this trade through ruin, exile, or desperation. They did not walk into some hidden school. There was no wise instructor waiting behind a heavy door, no ceremony, no oath sworn over candlelight. That entire picture, so familiar from later fiction, belongs to imagination rather than record. What actually existed instead was something far more improvised and far less forgiving, a kind of education assembled entirely out of near misses. Consider what a person in this position actually had to work with. If they had once been a soldier, they arrived already knowing how to hold a blade properly, how to strike with intent rather than panic, how their own body moved under the particular fear of combat. That was a genuine advantage, and evidence from surviving court testimonies across several regions suggests that former soldiers were indeed considered more reliable hires, precisely because they had already been tested under pressure and had not broken. But military training taught you how to kill an enemy who could see you coming, who was armed, who expected the fight. It taught you almost nothing about the far stranger, far quieter skill this new trade actually demanded, which was how to become invisible in a crowded room, how to wait without moving for hours at a stretch, how to read the rhythm of a household you had never entered before and know, within moments, which door led to safety and which led to a locked courtyard with no way out. For those without any military background at all, the learning curve was steeper still and considerably more dangerous. Historians studying this period often point to a grim but telling pattern that the earliest attempts by untrained individuals frequently failed, sometimes catastrophically, and that the ones who survived those early failures were the ones who went on to do this work again. It is a kind of brutal natural selection, though nobody at the time would have used that language. A person's second attempt existed only because their first attempt had gone badly enough to teach them something, but not so badly that it killed them. The margin between those two outcomes was often shockingly thin. A single misjudged footstep, a single dog that barked at the wrong moment, a single guard who happened to glance toward a shadow rather than past it. What surprises most people the first time they encounter this history is just how much of the actual craft came down to the human body itself, rather than any weapon or plan. Consider something as simple as walking. It sounds almost absurd to dwell on, and yet surviving accounts describe how a person's gait, the particular sound their feet made against stone or packed earth, could betray them as surely as any weapon found in their possession. Court records from certain Italian city-states describe watchmen trained to listen for the specific rhythm of a stranger's footsteps in the dark, a rhythm that differed subtly from the familiar pattern of household staff who belonged there, and moved with the unconscious ease of people who were not afraid of being caught. Learning to walk like you belonged somewhere you very much did not belong was not a skill anyone could teach in an afternoon. It had to be practiced, refined through repeated exposure to real risk until the fear itself no longer changed the sound of your feet against the ground. Poison offers perhaps the clearest window into how much of this trade was pure trial and error, dressed up afterward in a mythology of expertise it rarely earned. We tend to imagine medieval poisoners as possessing a kind of dark botanical wisdom, precise and calculated, capable of measuring exactly the dose that would end a life quietly and on schedule. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how widespread genuine expertise was, but what fragments survive paint a messier picture. Medieval poisoners worked without any standardized measurement, without any scientific understanding of dosage as we would recognize it today, relying instead on inherited folk knowledge, half-remembered instructions passed along by word of mouth, and a considerable amount of guesswork. A substance that killed one person within an hour might leave another only mildly ill for a week, depending on factors nobody at the time understood. Body weight, what the victim had eaten that day, how fresh or stale the poison itself happened to be. Some accounts describe intended victims who survived a poisoning entirely emerging only with a lingering suspicion of their own kitchen staff, while the person who administered the poison had no way of knowing whether they had failed through error or through some invisible factor entirely beyond their control. This uncertainty was not a minor inconvenience. It was the defining condition of the work itself. There is a scientific detail here that rarely makes it into popular retellings of this history, and it concerns the plants themselves. Many of the substances available to a medieval poisoner extracts from foxglove, from certain varieties of nightshade, from hemlock, gathered along riverbanks and roadsides contain compounds whose concentration varies enormously depending on soil season and even the specific week a plant was harvested. A person gathering hemlock in early spring might unknowingly collect a far weaker dose than someone gathering the same plant later in the season, when the toxic compounds within it had fully matured. Without any laboratory, without any way to test potency in advance, every single poisoning was in the most literal sense an experiment performed on a living person, with the poisoner learning the results only by watching whether their target lived or died. It is a sobering thing to sit with. How much of what we now romanticize as a shadowy, precise craft was actually closer to blind chance, repeated by people with nothing but their own survival riding on each attempt. Weapons training followed a similarly improvised path, though, with the added complication that a person in this position rarely had access to fine equipment of any kind. There were no custom blades commissioned for this work, no armourer willing to risk their own reputation and safety by knowingly outfitting someone for an assassination. What people actually carried tended to be whatever could be acquired without drawing attention, a dagger taken from a fallen soldier on some earlier battlefield, a length of cord that could serve as a garrote if the moment demanded it, sometimes nothing more specialised than a common kitchen knife sharpened carefully and hidden beneath a cloak. Scholars still debate how much of this improvisation reflected genuine poverty versus a deliberate strategy, since an ordinary-looking weapon was also far less likely to draw suspicion if a person was searched or questioned before they had the chance to use it. Perhaps it was both at once, necessity shaping itself over time into something that resembled strategy. What almost never happened, and this is worth sitting with, was any kind of mentorship in the way we might imagine it today. An older figure patiently guiding a younger one through the finer points of the trade. Occasionally, rarely surviving records hint at something like an informal arrangement, an older and more experienced individual allowing someone younger to observe or assist on a single job, passing along a fragment of hard-won knowledge, how to move without squeaking floorboards, how to identify which servants were most likely to notice an unfamiliar face. But these arrangements, where they existed at all, appear to have been fleeting, born more of temporary convenience than any lasting bond. This was not a trade that rewarded loyalty or long relationships. The safest amount of connection to another person doing this same work was usually none at all, because every person you knew was another person who could, under torture or simple fear, speak your name to save themselves. So the education in the end was almost entirely solitary, built one dangerous encounter at a time, refined through injuries that never fully healed, and mistakes that could just as easily have been the last one a person ever made. There was no ceremony marking the moment someone became competent at this work. There was only the quiet, private knowledge held by the person alone that they had survived long enough to try again. And that knowledge, fragile and hard-earned as it was, became the only credential that mattered in a trade with no guild, no title, and no one left to vouch for you, but your own continued unlikely existence. But surviving your own early mistakes was only ever the beginning. Somewhere beyond that first fragile competence waited an entirely different problem, one that had nothing to do with skill at all, and everything to do with whether the person who had hired you ever intended to pay what they promised in the first place. Money changes hands more often in the dark than anywhere else in this story, and almost none of it changes hands the way it was promised. Picture the arrangement itself, because it rarely looked like anything formal. There was no written contract, obviously, since a written contract would have been a confession waiting to be found. Instead, the agreement usually passed through an intermediary, someone who knew both the client and the person, willing to do the work a go-between, whose own reputation depended on neither side feeling cheated, at least not badly enough to cause trouble. This intermediary role turns out to be one of the more overlooked figures in this entire history. Court records from several regions describe individuals, often innkeepers, sometimes minor clergy with surprisingly flexible morals, who made a quiet living simply connecting desperate people with desperate needs. They took a portion of the payment for themselves, arranged the meeting, and then disappeared from the story entirely, leaving almost no trace behind except an occasional mention in a confession extracted under far less gentle circumstances than this telling deserves to dwell on tonight. The payment itself, when it existed at all, typically arrived in two parts, half before, half after, and that structure alone tells you almost everything you need to know about how little trust existed on either side of this arrangement. The first half was rarely enough to live on for long, a handful of silver coins, sometimes a small parcel of goods that could be sold quietly without drawing questions about where they came from. It was enough to buy passage somewhere, enough to buy a night's food and shelter, but never enough to disappear entirely and start a different life. That was almost certainly intentional. A person who received full payment up front had no remaining incentive to complete a dangerous task. A person who received only half had every reason to finish the job and come looking for the rest. And that is exactly where so many of these arrangements fell apart, because the client, once the deed was done, faced a very simple and very cold calculation. Paying the remaining sum meant keeping a promise to someone who now knew in intimate detail exactly what that client had done, and exactly how they had done it. Not paying meant risking the anger of a person who had just demonstrated quite recently, and quite effectively, their willingness to kill. Scholars still debate how often clients chose to simply vanish rather than pay, since the evidence survives only in scattered fragments. A chronicler's passing remark here, a court testimony there, but the pattern that does survive suggests it happened often enough that experienced people in this trade came to expect it as a normal cost of the work rather than an unusual betrayal. Some clients went further than simple avoidance. There are documented cases, though. The details remain frustratingly incomplete, of clients who arranged for the very person they had hired to be killed shortly after completing the job, tying off what must have felt from their perspective like the last loose thread connecting them to a crime. One particularly striking account from a court record in the Italian peninsula describes a wealthy merchant who hired two separate individuals for what appeared at first glance to be two entirely unrelated tasks. Only much later, through testimony given by a servant who had overheard fragments of conversation never meant for her ears, did it become clear that the second person had actually been hired to eliminate the first immediately after the original task was finished. The merchant, it seems, had never intended to pay either of them the sum promised. He had intended from the very beginning for neither of them to survive long enough to spend it. There is something worth sitting with in that detail because it reveals a truth about power that runs far deeper than this particular century. The people doing the actual killing were, in the eyes of those who hired them, always somewhat disposable, useful, only for the specific window of time in which they were needed. Once that window closed, they became something else entirely, a liability, a walking piece of evidence, a person who knew a secret capable of ending a noble family's standing or even their lives. Why would someone like that ever be allowed to simply walk away carrying that knowledge with them into taverns and marketplaces where a careless word spoken after too much wine could unravel everything? This fear was not paranoia. It was, in a grim sense, entirely rational, and it shaped the behavior of everyone involved in ways that still show up in the surviving record. People who did this work learned, often through hard experience, to demand as much payment up front as they possibly could to never reveal their true names, even to the intermediaries who arranged their jobs, and to avoid ever returning to collect a remaining balance in person if there was any safer alternative. Some accounts describe elaborate arrangements involving hidden drop points, a payment left beneath a particular stone near a crossroads collected only after enough time had passed to confirm no ambush was waiting. It is a strange thing to imagine a person crouched in darkness near a pile of stones, watching for hours before daring to approach money that was rightfully theirs because the alternative, simply walking up and taking it, carried too great a risk of walking into a trap instead. What makes this even more unsettling if you sit with it long enough is how little legal recourse existed for anyone caught in this particular kind of betrayal. A merchant who cheated another merchant in an honest trade dispute could, at least in theory, bring a complaint before a local court appeal to guild regulations, seek some form of restitution recognized by the structures of that society. A person cheated out of payment for a killing had no such option. There was no court in medieval Europe that would hear a complaint framed, however politely, as a dispute over an unpaid contract for murder. The very nature of the work placed everyone involved entirely outside the protection of law, which meant that betrayal, when it came with absolutely no consequence attached, no matter how unjust it might have felt to the person on the receiving end of it. This absence of legal protection produced something else worth noticing, a kind of quiet, informal justice that occasionally surfaces in the historical record cases where a cheated individual returned not for the money owed, but simply to make certain the client who had betrayed them never had the chance to betray anyone else. The evidence remains incomplete on how common this actually was, since successful revenge of this kind would, by its very nature, leave behind very little trace beyond a second unexplained death sometime after the first. But the pattern shows up often enough in surviving accounts that historians studying this period generally accept it as a real, if uncommon, feature of the trade, a dark form of accountability existing entirely outside any formal system, enforced only by the willingness of desperate people to protect what little reputation and safety they had left. There is one more layer to this particular danger, one that rarely gets mentioned, even in more detailed retellings of this history, and it concerns the targets themselves rather than the clients who hired against them. Wealthy and powerful households across medieval Europe increasingly employed what we might now recognize as an early form of counterintelligence servants and retainers whose actual job, hidden beneath some more ordinary title, was to listen, to notice unfamiliar faces lingering near markets or taverns close to the household, To report unusual question asked by strangers about a lord's daily habits, his movements, the layout of his private chambers. A person planning to accept a job against a particularly well-guarded target might spend weeks simply gathering information before ever approaching the task itself, and every single one of those weeks carried its own separate risk of exposure, entirely apart from the danger of the act to come. The waiting itself, it turns out, could be just as deadly as the moment of action everyone imagines when they picture this world. So a person doing this work faced betrayal from every possible direction at once. Betrayal from clients who never intended to pay, betrayal from intermediaries who might sell information to the highest bidder rather than protect it. Even betrayal from within the very household they had been hired to infiltrate, where a single loyal servant watching a little too closely could end everything before the task was ever attempted. Trust in this particular life was not simply rare, it was, in the most literal sense, a luxury that very few people in this trade could afford to extend to anyone at all. And yet somehow, despite every one of these dangers, stacked one against another, some of these people did succeed in reaching their targets, did manage to slip past household staff trained to notice exactly the kind of stranger they were. How anyone managed that, given everything working against them, turns out to be its own remarkable story. One that begins not with a weapon at all, but with something far quieter and far harder to defend against. Patience, it turns out, was the deadliest weapon most of these people ever carried, far more reliable than any blade tucked beneath a cloak. Reaching a well-guarded target in a medieval household was never a matter of a single bold moment. It was a slow accumulation of small, careful choices, made over days or sometimes weeks, each one designed to make a stranger feel less and less like a stranger. Households of any real wealth or standing were not open spaces. They were layered, guarded, and increasingly wary as the century wore on, particularly among families who had already survived one attempt on a relative's life and had no intention of losing another. So the question worth sitting with is this: how does a person with no invitation, no name anyone recognizes, and no legitimate reason to be there actually walk through gate after gate and door after door without ever once being stopped? The answer more often than not was disguise built not from costume but from function. This detail tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, because we picture disguise as something visual, a hood, a cloak, a face obscured in shadow. But the far more effective version of disguise in this world had almost nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with occupation. A stranger standing idle near a noble's gate draws attention within minutes. A stranger carrying a bundle of firewood or leading a cart of turnips toward the kitchen entrance draws almost none at all. Households required a constant stream of outside labour simply to function: laundresses, delivery boys travelling, menders who fixed pots and sharpened knives, itinerant clergy passing through, on pilgrimage routes who might be offered a meal and a place to sleep in exchange for a blessing. Each of these roles came with its own built-in reason to be present, its own reason to move through certain parts of a household without explanation. A person willing to study these roles carefully, to learn how a real laundress carried herself, how a real travelling mender spoke to kitchen staff, could effectively borrow that invisibility for as long as the disguise held. Some of the surviving accounts describing this kind of infiltration are remarkably specific, almost uncomfortably so, once you sit with what they actually required. One case recorded in a court document from a German territory in the 14th century describes an individual who spent nearly 3 weeks working as a temporary stable hand in a noble household before ever making an attempt on the intended target. 3 weeks of mucking out stalls, feeding animals, sleeping in a hayloft alongside genuine stable staff who had no idea their quiet, hard-working new companion was there for any reason beyond wages. 3 weeks of learning which guards drank too much on which nights which doors were left unbarred during the earliest hours of morning, when the household staff assumed everyone with any business being awake was already accounted for. That kind of patience is difficult to imagine now in a world that moves as quickly as ours does, but it was, in a very real sense, the actual craft. Not the moment of violence itself, which might last only seconds, but the long, careful unravelling of a household's rhythm that made those seconds possible at all. There is something quietly remarkable in how much attention these people paid to sounder detail. Scholars researching this period keep returning to, because it appears again and again across otherwise unrelated cases from different regions and different centuries. Wooden floors creak in patterns particular to their construction, and a person who spent enough time within a household, even in a lowly role, could learn exactly which boards to avoid and which stairs groaned loudly enough to wake a light sleeper. Dogs presented an entirely separate challenge, and several surviving accounts mention the deliberate feeding of household dogs in the days leading up to an attempt. Small offerings meant to build familiarity so that a bark of alarm might become instead the quiet recognition of someone who'd been kind before. Whether this actually worked as reliably as the accounts suggest is difficult to say with certainty, since dogs are unpredictable animals, and the evidence remains incomplete on how often this particular strategy succeeded versus how often it simply failed and ended a person's attempt before it truly began. Even with every precaution taken, even with weeks of careful preparation behind them, the single greatest danger any of these people faced rarely came from a guard's blade or a locked door. It came from the ordinary watchful curiosity of other servants. Households were in their own quiet way small communities, and small communities noticed new faces the way a still pond notices a stone. A servant who had shared a kitchen table with the same handful of familiar people for years would almost certainly notice someone unfamiliar lingering a little too long near a private stairwell, asking a question that seemed innocent enough on its surface but did not quite match the story they'd given for their presence. This is perhaps the detail that most defies the popular image of the graceful, untouchable assassin moving unseen through candle-lit halls. In truth, the greatest threat was rarely a trained soldier standing at attention with a spear. It was a scullery maid, pausing mid-task, eyes narrowing slightly quietly, deciding whether to mention what she had just seen to someone with more authority than herself. And this raises a question worth sitting with for a moment, one that historians studying this period continue to turn over without ever quite landing on a single satisfying answer. Why did so many of these attempts succeed at all, given how thoroughly stacked the odds appear against them? Part of the answer likely lies in simple human nature, the same nature that exists in any era. People grow tired. People grow complacent after weeks or months without incident. A guard who has stood watch at the same gate every night for 3 years without a single disturbance is a very different guard psychologically than one standing watch on his very first assignment. Vigilance is exhausting to sustain indefinitely, and the people who understood this, who learned to recognize the particular carelessness that settles into any household after a long stretch of calm, held an advantage that had nothing to do with weapons or training at all. It was simply the advantage of watching more carefully than anyone expected to be watched. Not every disguise relied on humble labor, though those cases tend to dominate the surviving record. A smaller number of documented attempts describe individuals posing as minor clergy, a role that carried its own particular kind of protection, since medieval households, whatever their private cynicism, were generally reluctant to turn away a travelling priest or a wandering friar without offering at least a night's hospitality. Religious dress opened doors that ordinary labour never could, granting access to more intimate spaces within a household, private chapels, family, chambers set aside for prayer and confession, places where a lord or lady might be found alone, without the usual cluster of guards and attendants nearby. Whether this particular strategy was common or rare remains genuinely uncertain, since the surviving evidence for it comes primarily from a handful of especially well-documented cases in regions with unusually thorough court records, and scholars are careful not to generalize too broadly from what might simply be the exceptions history happened to preserve. What almost never appears in the record, interestingly enough, is anything resembling the elaborate mechanical trickery so beloved by later fiction hidden. Compartments, secret passages built specifically for this purpose, elaborate escape routes planned with architectural precision. The actual craft, as best we can reconstruct it, was almost entirely psychological rather than mechanical. It relied on understanding people, their habits, their blind spots, the particular exhaustion that settles into anyone who has performed the same routine for too long without incident. A guard bored after months of uneventful watch. A household grown comfortable after years without a single serious threat. A servant too polite or too tired to question a stranger's story a second time. These were the actual gaps that made the impossible occasionally possible gaps, built not from any flaw in a castle's stone walls, but from something far more universal and far harder to defend against the simple, unavoidable humanity of the people standing guard within them. There is a strange kind of intimacy hidden inside all of this one that rarely gets acknowledged. To successfully infiltrate a household this way required, in a very real sense, coming to know that household better than some of the people who lived there their entire lives. A person hired to end a single life often spent far more hours quietly studying that household's rhythms, its habits, its particular silences, than most of the guests who passed through its halls at feasts and celebrations ever did. There is something almost unbearably sad in that if you sit with it long enough. A stranger arriving with violent intent who nonetheless comes to understand a place and the people within it with a depth and patience that borders on something like devotion, all in service of a single terrible moment that would end it. But understanding a household, learning its rhythms, earning its unsuspecting trust was never the final challenge. It was only the long, quiet approach to something far more difficult, the single moment when every week of patience either paid for itself completely or came apart in an instant that could never be taken back. There is a particular kind of chance that settles over a room in the last few seconds before something irreversible happens, and almost every surviving account of this world, however fragmentary, seems to circle back to that same held breath. By the time a person reached this moment, weeks or sometimes months of preparation stood behind them, all of it narrowing down to a window of time that might last only a few seconds. And here is something worth understanding clearly before we go further, because it corrects a common misconception. This was almost never a dramatic confrontation. It was almost never a fight in any sense we would recognize from later fiction blades crossing. A desperate struggle between two evenly matched opponents. The entire purpose of everything that came before the disguise, the patience, the weeks of quiet study existed specifically to avoid a fight altogether. A confrontation meant noise meant witnesses, and witnesses meant almost certain death for the person attempting this task. Success in its truest form looked less like combat and more like a held breath, a single decisive motion, and then absolute stillness immediately afterward, stillness held long enough to be certain no one nearby had stirred. Consider the physical reality of what this actually required. Striking a sleeping or unsuspecting person quickly enough to prevent any outcry demands a very particular kind of precision, one that has almost nothing in common with the wild, swinging violence so often depicted in later retellings. Surviving accounts pieced together from court testimonies and the occasional unusually detailed chronicle describe attacks aimed specifically at preventing sound as much as causing death. A hand pressed firmly over a mouth in the same motion as the strike itself, timed so precisely that the two actions became in effect a single movement rather than two separate ones. This required not raw strength, which is the quality popular imagination tends to emphasize, but an almost surgical calm, the kind that can only be built through the accumulated experience of having done something similar before, or through a very particular temperament that allowed a person to function with total steadiness in a moment that would paralyze almost anyone else. What historians studying this period find genuinely striking is how often these attempts depended less on the moment of the act itself, and more on what happened in the 60 seconds immediately following it. A person who had just ended a life inside a guarded household faced an entirely new and equally dangerous problem, the problem of leaving. Every door they had entered through now represented a potential exit, but also a potential trap, since the household's rhythm had shifted the instant that life ended, even if no one yet knew it. Some accounts describe individuals who planned their departure route with as much care as their entrance timing, their exit to coincide with a shift change among guards or with the natural bustle of early morning kitchen activity that made a single figure moving through a courtyard far less conspicuous than it would have been in the dead of night. Here is a detail that surprises many people the first time they encounter it, and it concerns something almost mundane: footwear. Several surviving accounts from different regions specifically mention soft leather soles, sometimes wrapped additionally in cloth worn deliberately to muffle sound against stone floors during precisely this kind of departure. It seems a small thing, hardly the stuff of dramatic legend, and yet this single unglamorous detail, quiet shoes chosen with care, may have mattered more to a person's survival than any weapon they carried. Scholars still debate how widespread this particular practice actually was, since it left behind so little direct evidence. Footwear rarely survives centuries the way stone or metal does, but the repeated mentions across otherwise unconnected accounts suggest it was at minimum a known and valued technique among people who did this kind of work. There is something else worth sitting with here. A psychological dimension of this moment that rarely receives the attention it deserves. What did it actually feel like in a human sense to end a life and then be required immediately without any pause for reflection or grief or even simple human reaction to become perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, perfectly capable of walking past other people without betraying anything at all? We have almost no direct testimony describing this internal experience, since almost none of these people left behind any written account of their own inner lives, and the evidence remains genuinely incomplete on this point in a way that feels different from the uncertainty we have encountered elsewhere in this story. This is not simply a gap in the historical record. It is in a deeper sense an entire dimension of human experience that history has almost completely failed to preserve. The private cost carried by people whose profession demanded the total suppression of any visible reaction to what they had just done. What we do have occasionally are glimpses second-hand and fragmentary, filtered through the observations of others, rather than the words of the people themselves. One account recorded by a chronicler in the Burgundian territories describes an individual apprehended sometime after a killing, whose interrogators noted with something like professional curiosity how remarkably composed he remained, even under considerable duress, a composure the chronicler attributed with the casual cruelty typical of the period to a fundamentally cold and inhuman nature. It is worth pausing on that interpretation because it tells us something about how medieval society made sense of people who could function this way. Rather than recognizing the possibility of trained self-control, or the numbing effect of repeated exposure to violence, observers at the time reached instead for explanations involving an absence of normal human feeling altogether, as though calm under pressure could only mean the absence of a soul, rather than the presence of extraordinary discipline. Is it possible, though, that this composure was never truly effortless at all, but simply well concealed? That question has no clear answer in the surviving record, and perhaps it never can. Given how thoroughly these individuals were required to hide any sign of internal struggle, not only from their targets and from household staff, but quite possibly from themselves, as well as a matter of simple survival. We know from studies of trauma and violence across many different historical periods that repeated exposure to extreme stress does leave lasting marks on a person, even when those marks remain entirely invisible to observers at the time. It seems reasonable to imagine, without overstating what the fragmentary evidence can actually support, that the calm so often noted in these accounts came at a cost that history simply had no mechanism to record. The immediate aftermath of a completed task brought its own distinct set of dangers separate from anything encountered during the approach itself. A household that discovers a death, even one initially mistaken for natural causes, tends to respond with a flurry of activity entirely unlike its normal rhythm servants, moving with unusual urgency. Doors that were previously left unattended, suddenly guarded questions asked of anyone whose presence seemed even slightly unaccounted for. The person who had just completed the task needed to be gone completely and convincingly gone before that shift in atmosphere fully took hold, which meant the margin for error in the minutes immediately following success was often narrower than at any other point in the entire undertaking. And this raises something worth considering carefully before we move any further into this story. We have spent this time understanding how a person actually reached a target, how they managed the act itself, how they attempted to vanish afterward without a trace. But success, however narrowly achieved, was never truly the end of danger. Simply exchanged one set of risks for another, quieter but no less serious risks that would follow a person for months, sometimes years, long after the household in question had returned on the surface at least to something resembling its former calm. A person who had just walked away from a completed task carried something far heavier than the bag of coins tucked beneath his shirt, and that weight had almost nothing to do with money at all. It has to do with a very particular kind of fear, one that grows rather than fades in the weeks following a successful task. Grows because the immediate danger of the act itself has passed, but a new and stranger danger takes its place, the danger of being remembered. A face glimpsed for only a moment by a servant hurrying past. A voice overheard by someone who thought little of it at the time, but might weeks later mention it in passing to exactly the wrong listener. History rarely gives us the luxury of knowing how many people in this trade were eventually undone not by any dramatic pursuit, but by a single careless remark repeated in a tavern many miles and many months removed from where the actual task had taken place. What makes this particularly worth sitting with is how thoroughly it reshaped a person's entire way of existing in the world long after any specific danger had technically passed. Several surviving accounts describe individuals who adopted what modern readers might recognize as a permanent low-level vigilance, an inability to fully relax, even in situations that carried no obvious threat. One especially detailed account recorded in a French court document from the 15th century describes a man apprehended years after his suspected involvement in a nobleman's death, whose interrogators noted that he had, in the intervening years, changed his name at least 3 times, relocated across 4 different towns, and consistently avoided any lodging that did not offer a clear view of its own entrance. Whether this behaviour reflected genuine guilt over a specific act or simply the accumulated caution of a life spent constantly anticipating discovery, the record does not say with certainty. But the pattern itself, this restless, permanent unsettledness, appears again and again across otherwise unconnected cases, suggesting it was less an individual quirk than something closer to an occupational condition. There is a detail here that surprises many people, one that complicates the popular image of the assassin as someone who simply vanished into anonymity and lived out a quiet, untroubled life on their earnings. The evidence remains incomplete on how often this actually happened, but what fragments survive suggest that true lasting anonymity was far harder to achieve than we might assume, Medieval society, for all its vastness compared to a single household or village, was in another sense remarkably interconnected, particularly among the travelling merchants, itinerant clergy, and wandering labourers whose paths crossed constantly across regions. A person attempting to disappear into a new town under a new name still had to interact with that town's baker, its innkeeper, its local priest, each interaction carrying some small risk of a recognised face or a familiar turn of phrase giving them away. True invisibility, it turns out, was less a permanent state a person could achieve and more a fragile condition that had to be actively maintained day after day for the rest of a person's life. Some individuals, according to the surviving records, attempted something bolder than simple disappearance. They sought out entirely new identities within respectable trades, apprenticing themselves often at an age well beyond what was typical to craftsmen who had no knowledge of their past. A small number of court records describe individuals eventually exposed as former participants in this shadow trade who had by the time of their discovery spent years building genuinely respectable lives, married, raising children known to their neighbours as reliable and unremarkable people. What must it have been like, one wonders, to build an entire second life on top of a foundation you could never fully trust, knowing that a single unlucky encounter could unravel everything you had carefully constructed. Scholars still debate how common this particular path actually was, since successful cases would, by definition, leave far less trace in the historical record than the failures that led to eventual discovery and prosecution. There is a psychological dimension to this that deserves particular attention because it reveals something genuinely human beneath all the caution and disguise. Several accounts hint indirectly and often through the observations of others, rather than direct testimony, at a persistent difficulty these individuals faced in forming any lasting close relationship. A wife who noticed her husband startled awake at small sounds in the night. A neighbour who found something faintly unsettling, and how carefully a person avoided ever speaking about their years before arriving in a particular town. Trust having once been the single most dangerous thing a person in this trade could extend to anyone, does not simply switch back on once the danger has technically passed. It seems entirely plausible, based on what we understand about how sustained fear shapes human behaviour across many different historical contexts, that this defensive posture, once built out of genuine necessity, became something these individuals carried with them permanently, an invisible wall between themselves and anyone who might have offered them real companionship. We should be careful here, though, not to overstate what the evidence can actually support. This is precisely the kind of interpretation that feels intuitively true, and likely captures something real about the emotional cost of this life, but the historical record itself remains frustratingly quiet on the inner experience of the people who lived it. What survives are the external traces, the changed names, the relocated households, the occasional court testimony describing behaviour that struck contemporaries as unusually guarded or watchful. The rest, the actual felt experience of carrying this particular kind of secret for years or decades, remains largely unrecoverable, lost along with the people who alone could have described it honestly. Money itself, once finally secured, brought its own complications that rarely receive attention in popular retellings of this history. A person suddenly possessing a sum of coin far beyond what their apparent trade or station could reasonably explain risked drawing exactly the kind of unwanted attention they had spent so much effort avoiding. Several accounts describe individuals who deliberately spent their earnings slowly over years rather than months, disguising sudden wealth as the gradual accumulation of an ordinary hard-working life, rather than the product of a single dangerous night. This meant that even success, even payment successfully collected, did not translate into the kind of immediate relief or security we might expect. It simply converted one form of danger, the risk of violence, into another, quieter form, the risk of visibility itself. Perhaps this is the detail worth holding on to longest as we sit here together in the quiet. that a life built around this particular trade never truly offered an ending, not in the way most lives eventually find some measure of settled peace. There was no clear moment when the danger officially concluded, no ceremony, marking safe passage into an ordinary existence. There was only at best a gradual, incomplete fading of risk, always present somewhere beneath the surface, always capable of resurfacing without warning for as long as a single person anywhere in the world still remembered a face and name, or a night that was never meant to be spoken of again. And that quiet, permanent uncertainty, that inability to ever fully exhale, brings us to a question we have not yet asked directly, one that sits at the very heart of why so few people who entered this trade ever managed to leave it entirely behind, even long after the coin itself had been spent and forgotten. Fear, when it settles into an entire community rather than a single household, behaves less like an emotion and more like whether something that shapes everything beneath it without anyone quite agreeing on where it began. This is the territory we enter now, moving beyond the individual household and its guarded doors out into the wider world of villages and market towns where rumour travelled faster than any messenger on horseback. Because the danger facing a person in this trade was never limited to the specific target and household they approached, it extended outward into the ordinary daily life of ordinary people who understood almost nothing about how this work actually functioned and filled that gap in understanding with something far more frightening than the truth. Consider what an unexplained death actually meant to most people living in a medieval village or town. Medicine as we would recognize it barely existed. A sudden illness that struck down an otherwise healthy person within days, the kind of illness we might now attribute with confidence to poisoning, arrived instead into a worldview with no reliable framework for distinguishing natural misfortune from deliberate harm. Scholars still debate how frequently genuine poisonings were mistaken for illness, and how frequently the reverse occurred, ordinary disease misread as the work of some hidden hand, since medieval record-keeping rarely included anything resembling the forensic detail we would now consider necessary to tell the two apart with any confidence. What survives instead is a pattern of suspicion spreading through communities with a speed and intensity that had very little to do with actual evidence. This suspicion took a particular shape, one that revealed something genuinely surprising about how medieval society understood this shadow trade. Rather than viewing a hired killer as simply a desperate ordinary person, driven to extreme measures, which the evidence overwhelmingly suggests was closer to the truth, popular belief across much of medieval Europe leaned instead toward something closer to the supernatural. Individuals suspected of this work were frequently described in surviving accounts using language that had far more in common with witchcraft accusations than with any straightforward criminal suspicion. Whispers of pacts made with dark spirits, claims that a person could move unseen, not through skill or careful timing, but through some unnatural, almost demonic ability granted by forces outside the normal order of things. It is a striking detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells us something about how frightening the unexplainable was to people who had no other framework for making sense of it. A person who could enter a heavily guarded household and leave again without a trace seemed to many observers at the time less like a skilled and desperate human being, and more like something that did not entirely belong to the natural world at all. Why might that particular interpretation have felt more comforting in a strange way than the truth? Perhaps because the truth was in its own quiet fashion far more unsettling, accepting that an ordinary person, a former soldier, a desperate servant, someone who might otherwise pass entirely unnoticed in a crowded market, could learn to kill and vanish through nothing, more than patience and careful study meant, accepting that almost anyone under the right circumstances of desperation might be capable of the same thing. It is considerably easier psychologically to believe that such a person possesses some unnatural gift. setting them apart from ordinary humanity, than to sit with the far more uncomfortable possibility that the difference between an ordinary neighbour and a hired killer might come down to nothing more than the particular cruelty of circumstance. This fear, once it took hold within a community, rarely stayed contained to rational suspicion alone. Several surviving court records describe incidents that modern readers would recognise immediately as something close to mob violence. Communities turning against individuals suspected often on remarkably thin evidence of involvement in this trade. One particularly well-documented case from a town in the Rhineland describes a travelling stranger, a man whose only apparent crime was arriving in town shortly before a local merchant's unexplained death, who was seized by a gathering crowd and subjected to violence that the surviving record describes only in the vaguest, most euphemistic terms. The kind of restraint in language that, if you know how to read it, usually signals something the chronicler found too disturbing to describe plainly. Whether this particular stranger had any actual connection to the merchant's death remains entirely unknown. The evidence that survives tells us only that suspicion once ignited within a frightened community required remarkably little actual proof to turn deadly. There is something worth understanding here about the particular vulnerability of anyone who existed outside a community's ordinary recognised structures. A travelling labourer with no local family to vouch for his character. A woman living alone without a husband's protection or a father's reputation standing behind her. These were precisely the people most likely to fall under suspicion when an unexplained death disturbed a community's sense of order, not necessarily because any real evidence pointed toward them, but simply because they existed already at the margins of what that community considered normal and trustworthy. It is a pattern that echoes uncomfortably across many different periods of history, the way fear tends to settle most heavily on those already lacking the social protection that might otherwise shield them from suspicion. What makes this particular chapter of the story genuinely difficult to sit with is how it complicates any simple picture of victim and perpetrator. The people we have spent this entire evening following, the desperate soldiers, the fleeing servants, the women whose invisibility became a strange professional advantage, were in the specific moments we have examined so far the ones causing harm. But viewed through this wider lens of communal fear and suspicion, many of these same people, and countless others who had done nothing at all beyond existing as strangers in the wrong place at the wrong time, became something else entirely, targets themselves of a fear so untethered from actual evidence that it could destroy an innocent travelling stranger with the same ease it might occasionally catch someone genuinely guilty. The evidence remains incomplete on how many people caught up in this particular kind of suspicion were actually connected to the trade we've been discussing versus how many were simply unlucky strangers who happened to arrive in the wrong town at the wrong moment. This uncertainty is not a small gap in an otherwise clear picture. It sits instead at the very centre of understanding this era, honestly a reminder that medieval justice, when fear ran high enough, often cared considerably less about actual guilt than about restoring as quickly and visibly as possible a community's shattered sense of safety. There is a quieter, sadder thread running beneath all of this one worth pausing on before we move any further tonight. For the people we have been following throughout this story, this widespread fear of the supernatural, however irrational, may have occasionally offered a strange unintended form of protection. A community convinced that a hired killer possessed genuinely unnatural abilities was in a curious way less likely to look carefully at the very ordinary, very human details that might otherwise have exposed a real person's real involvement. A familiar face glimpsed too many times near a household a stranger's questions that did not quite add up. Sometimes it seems being feared as something beyond human offered better cover than being understood as simply painfully human. And that particular irony fear built on misunderstanding, occasionally shielding the very truth it claimed to guard against, sites at the heart of something we have not yet fully explored: the strange, complicated relationship between what a community believed about this trade and what actually happened when suspicion finally did land correctly or not on someone unable to prove their innocence. When suspicion finally landed on the right person, rather than an unlucky stranger caught in the wrong current of fear, the machinery that followed looked almost nothing like anything we would now recognize as a fair trial. And understanding that machinery tells us something important about what justice actually meant in this particular century. Capture itself rarely happened through careful investigation in the way we might imagine today. There was no systematic gathering of evidence, no methodical piecing together of movements and motives. Far more often, according to surviving court records across several regions, capture came through betrayal, an intermediary questioned under pressure and willing to trade a name for their own safety, or a fellow traveller who had shared a room at an inn and later, for a price or out of simple fear, repeated an overheard detail to the wrong ears. The entire trade, built as it was on isolation and secrecy, remained perpetually vulnerable to this particular weakness: the fact that every person who knew even a fragment of the truth represented a potential unravelling, waiting only for the right combination of pressure and opportunity to come undone. Once captured, a person suspected of this work entered a legal process almost entirely unlike anything resembling a modern trial. Confession rather than physical evidence stood at the very centre of medieval justice, and confession was frequently obtained through methods that a listener tonight would find genuinely difficult to sit with in detail. So we will approach this honestly, but without dwelling in specifics that serve no real purpose beyond distress. What matters historically is understanding that the goal of interrogation in this period was rarely to determine truth through careful reasoning. It was far more often to produce an admission, and a system oriented around producing admissions, rather than establishing facts, inevitably swept up a considerable number of people who may have had little or no actual connection to the crime in question. Scholars still debate how many confessions extracted under this kind of pressure reflected genuine guilt versus simple exhaustion and desperation, a person willing to say almost anything to end an unbearable process, regardless of whether it was true. This uncertainty matters enormously because it means the historical record itself, built substantially on surviving confessions and court testimonies, cannot be taken entirely at face value. Some of the people whose stories survive in these documents may well have been exactly what the record claims: skilled and deliberate participants in this shadow trade. Others may have been ordinary, unlucky individuals who simply happened to fit a convenient narrative and who confessed whatever their interrogators wished to hear, long before any genuine truth could be established. The punishment awaiting a confirmed participant in this trade was without exception severe, and it was almost always designed to be witnessed publicly rather than carried out in any private or contained way. This detail matters because it reveals something important about what these punishments were actually meant to accomplish. They were not simply about ending one person's life as a consequence for their actions. They were performances carefully staged for an audience, intended to communicate a very specific message to everyone gathered to watch. Several surviving accounts describe executions carried out at prominent public locations: market squares, the open ground before a town's main gate, chosen specifically for their visibility, rather than any practical consideration of convenience. The body in many documented cases remained on display for a period afterward, sometimes displayed at the very gate of the city or the household that had been targeted, a lingering reminder rather than a swift, contained conclusion. There is a particular detail here worth sitting with because it illuminates something genuinely important about how medieval society understood crime and consequence differently than we tend to today. The punishment was rarely calibrated to fit the specific circumstances of an individual case. The degree of desperation that led someone to this work, the question of whether they had acted alone or under someone else's direction and protection, it was calibrated instead to the status of the victim. A successful attempt against a minor merchant carried consequences of one severity. A successful or even attempted act against someone of noble blood carried consequences of an entirely different magnitude, regardless of the actual circumstances surrounding the individual case. This reflects something true about the deeper structure of medieval society itself, a world organized far more around preserving the visible order of rank and hierarchy than around anything resembling equal justice applied consistently to every person regardless of who they had harmed. What happened to the client? The person who had actually commissioned the act in the first place presents one of the more quietly telling contrasts in this entire history. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete here, but the pattern that does survive suggests something uncomfortable and consistent. Clients of sufficient wealth and standing were considerably more likely to escape any meaningful consequence at all, even in cases where their involvement seemed by the standards of the time reasonably well established. Several documented cases describe situations where the person who carried out an act faced severe public punishment, while the noble or wealthy figure who had commissioned it faced nothing more than a temporary loss of standing, quietly recovered within a few years, sometimes through nothing more than a suitable donation to the right church or a well-timed marriage alliance that repaired whatever damage their reputation had briefly suffered. Why might this pattern have held so consistently across so many different regions and centuries? Part of the answer lies in something we touched on earlier in this story. The simple structural reality that the wealthy possessed resources. The desperate never did legal advocates of a kind family connections capable of applying pressure on judges and local authorities. The ability to relocate temporarily until scrutiny faded. Options entirely unavailable to someone who had entered this trade precisely because they had already lost everything. Justice in this particular century was rarely blind in the way later legal traditions would come to idealize. It saw quite clearly who stood before it, and it treated different people very differently, depending on what they could offer in return for leniency. There is a specific case worth examining more closely, one that survives in unusually thorough detail, thanks to a particularly meticulous chronicler working in the Italian city-states during the early 14th century. A man identified in the surviving record only by a single name, that was almost certainly not his true one, was captured and executed for his role in the death of a minor nobleman, while the wealthy relative, widely believed even at the time to have commissioned the act, faced only a brief period of social awkwardness before resuming his position within local political life entirely unaffected. The chronicler, writing decades after the fact, notes this discrepancy with what reads even across the considerable distance of time like genuine discomfort and acknowledgement that something about this particular outcome felt wrong even by the standards of that era's own sense of justice. It is a rare and valuable thing, finding a medieval voice willing to question the fairness of its own society's structures, and it suggests that the imbalance we can identify so clearly now looking back with the benefit of distance was not entirely invisible to people living through it at the time either. This raises a genuinely difficult question worth sitting with. One this story has been circling since its very beginning. If the people who did this violent, desperate work were in the vast majority of documented cases driven to it by circumstances almost entirely outside their control, poverty, displacement, the absence of any other viable path forward, while the people who commissioned and benefited from that violence so often escaped any meaningful consequence at all, where does the true weight of responsibility for this entire dark chapter of history actually belong? Medieval society had its own answer to that question, one shaped overwhelmingly by rank and visible hierarchy, rather than by any deeper examination of circumstance or cause. Whether that answer was ever truly just is a question this history leaves open unresolved, the way so many genuine questions about power and consequence remain unresolved even now in our own considerably different century. Not every story we have gathered tonight ends in capture and public punishment, though. Some people remarkably manage to disappear so thoroughly, so completely, that no record of their eventual fate survives at all, neither confession nor execution, nor any trace beyond the single act that briefly and often incompletely entered the historical record. What happened to those people, the ones who simply vanished into the wider medieval world and were never heard from again, remains one of the more haunting, unanswerable threads running through this entire story. And it is exactly the kind of quiet mystery worth sitting with as we continue further into the night together. History rarely offers a clean ending for the stories it refuses to finish, and there are very few gaps in the historical record as genuinely haunting as this one. The disappearance of people who simply walked out of the surviving evidence, entirely leaving behind neither confession nor execution nor any further trace at all. Consider what disappearance actually required in a world with no centralized identification, no permanent records tracking most ordinary people across their lifetimes, no way for a town 200 miles distant to easily verify who a new arrival claimed to be. This absence of infrastructure, which made pursuit so difficult for anyone hunting, a fugitive worked in exactly the opposite direction for the fugitive themselves. A person willing to abandon everything familiar, a name, a region. Every relationship built before a certain point in their life possessed a genuine possibility of vanishing so completely that no chronicler, no court record, no surviving letter would ever again connect them to whatever they had done. The evidence remains incomplete here in a way that feels almost fitting given the subject. We cannot count the people who succeeded at this kind of disappearance, because success by its very definition left nothing behind to count. What we do have are occasional tantalizing fragments cases, where a partial trail exists before going permanently cold. One such fragment survives in a set of court documents from the Low Countries describing an investigation into a merchant's death that identifies a suspect by physical description, a scar above one eyebrow, a distinctive accent suggesting origin somewhere in the Eastern Territories but never by a confirmed name. The investigation continues for a period of months. According to the surviving record following reported sightings across 3 separate towns, each sighting less certain than the last until the trail simply stops mid-document with no further entries. We do not know whether this particular person was eventually caught elsewhere and tried under different circumstances that left no connection to this earlier case, whether they died of entirely unrelated causes before ever being found, or whether they genuinely lived out the remainder of their life in complete safety, carrying this single unresolved thread with them into old age, and eventually the grave. All 3 possibilities remain equally plausible, and the record itself offers no way to choose between them. There is something worth sitting with in that particular kind of not knowing because it differs from the uncertainty we have encountered elsewhere in this story. Earlier, when we discussed the difficulty of dosing a poison correctly, or the uncertain effectiveness of feeding a household's dogs to build familiarity, we were dealing with uncertainty about method, about how something was likely done given imperfect surviving evidence. This is a different kind of uncertainty entirely. Uncertainty about outcome, about what ultimately became of an actual human life once it slipped beyond the reach of any record we can now consult. It is in its own quiet way one of the more honest reminders this story offers that history is never truly complete, that for every life fully documented from beginning to end, countless others simply fade into a silence we have no way of filling regardless of how carefully we search. Some historians studying this period have turned their attention toward a related and equally uncertain question. What genuine long-term survival within this trade might have actually looked like for the rare individual who managed not just a single successful disappearance, but an entire lifetime spent moving in and out of this world without ever being caught. Surviving evidence for this kind of extended career remains thin, scattered across brief mentions in unrelated records rather than any single coherent account, but a small number of intriguing fragments do exist. One particularly interesting case comes from a set of property records in a German territory, documenting a man who arrived in a modest town sometime in his middle years, purchased a small parcel of land under a name with no prior local history, and lived out the remainder of his life as a moderately prosperous, entirely unremarkable member of that community, respected enough to be mentioned favourably in a local church's donation records shortly before his death. Nothing in this man's documented local life suggests any connection whatsoever to violence of any kind. The only reason his case draws any scholarly attention at all is a single surviving letter written by a distant relative decades after his death, making a passing and frustratingly vague reference to family rumours about his earlier years. Years the letter describes only as involving work the family preferred never to discuss in detail. Is this letter reliable evidence of anything at all, or simply an old family rumour, the kind every family accumulates over generations, regardless of whether any truth lies behind it? Scholars examining this particular case remain genuinely divided, and it would be irresponsible to present this as anything more certain than what it actually is, a single tantalizing fragment that might illuminate a genuine case of successful lifelong disappearance, or might equally represent nothing more than an old family story that grew more dramatic with each retelling across several generations. This is precisely the kind of evidence that makes this particular corner of history so difficult and, in its own way, so genuinely fascinating to study responsibly. The temptation to fill these gaps with confident narrative runs directly against everything careful historical work is meant to guard against. What we can say with somewhat more confidence is that successful long-term disappearance, however rare, would have required an entirely different set of skills than the act itself ever demanded. The patience to build a genuinely convincing new life, brick by careful brick over years rather than weeks. The discipline to never speak even once, even after decades of safety about what had come before. The willingness to watch a new community, a new set of neighbours, a new family, perhaps, all built on a foundation the person themselves could never fully trust, knowing that a single unlucky encounter, a traveller from the old region, a chance resemblance noticed by exactly the wrong person, could unravel everything in a single conversation. It is worth pausing on how genuinely difficult that particular kind of endurance must have been sustained not for a single dangerous night, but potentially for the remainder of an entire lifetime. There is a quieter, more universal thread running beneath all of this one that extends well beyond the specific and unusual case of medieval hired violence. Every era in its own way produces people who disappear from the historical record entirely, not through any dramatic act, but simply through the ordinary erosion of time records lost to fire or flood, names never written down in the first place. Lives lived and ended without leaving behind the particular kind of documentation that allows history to remember them at all. What makes the disappearances we have been discussing tonight feel different, perhaps, is the deliberate intention behind them, people actively working to erase themselves from a record that might otherwise have caught and held them, rather than simply falling through history's ordinary unintentional gaps. And yet, even acknowledging that difference, there is something almost universal in sitting with these vanished lives, something that reaches beyond the specific grim circumstances that drove them into hiding in the first place. Every person who has ever lived carries within them some version of this same quiet mystery, moments, decisions, entire chapters of an inner life that will never be fully known to anyone else, regardless of how thoroughly the outward facts of their existence happen to be recorded. Perhaps that is part of why these particular fragments of medieval history continue to draw such careful attention from historians and casual readers alike, centuries after the fact. They offer in an unusually stark and literal form a truth that applies far more broadly than this single trade or this single century that every human life contains rooms history was never invited into. Doors that remain closed no matter how carefully we search the surviving record for a way through. Not every attempt at this work ended in either capture or successful disappearance, though, and it would be incomplete to leave this particular corner of the story without acknowledging the far more common outcome that neither ended in quiet freedom nor in the theatrical public consequence we examined earlier. Some attempts simply failed in the plainest and most immediate sense. The target waking at the wrong moment, a hand trembling at exactly the instant it needed to be steady, a single misjudged step that turned careful silence into sudden irreversible noise. What actually happened in those specific immediate moments of failure, and what the surviving record can tell us about the particular terror of watching years of careful preparation collapse in the space of a single unguarded second, is a story that deserves its own careful, unhurried telling. And it is exactly where this quiet evening will take us next. A single unguarded second stretched impossibly long in memory separates every completed task in this story from every failed one, and it is worth spending real time with what that particular kind of failure actually looked and felt like, because it reveals something about this trade that success alone never fully could. Failure rarely announced itself gradually. It arrived, according to nearly every surviving account we have, in an instant, a single small event breaking a silence that had taken weeks to build. A floorboard that had held firm through every earlier practice pass finally giving way beneath a shifted weight. A sleeping target stirring at exactly the wrong moment, perhaps disturbed by nothing more than an ordinary dream, waking just enough to register a shape in the darkness that should not have been there. What strikes historians studying these fragmentary accounts most is how often the actual cause of failure had nothing at all to do with skill or preparation, and everything to do with simple, unpredictable chance, the kind no amount of patience or study could have anticipated or prevented. Consider what happened, according to one particularly detailed account surviving from a court record in the Kingdom of Aragon, when a planned attempt against a regional official went wrong. The individual involved had by every measure the surviving evidence allows us to reconstruct prepared, thoroughly spending several weeks establishing a plausible presence within the household as a hired labourer. The failure came not from any error in that preparation, but from something almost absurdly small. A household cat startled by an unfamiliar footstep in a normally empty corridor that knocked a metal vessel from a shelf in the darkness. The sound alone was enough. Guards who had grown comfortable through months without incident were suddenly fully alert, and the entire careful architecture of weeks of patient work collapsed within the space of perhaps 10 seconds. What happened in the immediate aftermath of a failure like this reveals something genuinely important about how differently this moment unfolded compared to the aftermath of success, where a completed task called for calm, controlled departure, careful timing, designed to blend into a household's normal rhythm. A failed attempt called for the exact opposite, immediate, desperate flight, with every advantage of patience and preparation suddenly stripped away. The person who had spent weeks studying a household's routines, learning its quiet hours and its careless odds guards, now had only seconds to make decisions under conditions no amount of prior study could have fully prepared them for. Several surviving accounts describe individuals attempting escape through windows never intended as exits, through narrow spaces meant for storage rather than passage, taking whatever route offered even the smallest chance of putting distance between themselves and an alarm that was by that point already spreading through the household like fire through dry grass. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on how frequently these failed attempts actually resulted in capture versus successful escape, since the surviving record naturally preserves cases that ended in capture and subsequent legal proceedings far more reliably than cases where someone simply vanished into the night, their failure known only to the shaken household they left behind. This creates a subtle but important distortion in how we understand this history, one worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. The failures we know about in detail are almost by definition the failures that ended badly enough to generate a surviving record. The failures that ended in a successful if humiliating escape into darkness left behind considerably less trace, which means our picture of failure in this trade is likely skewed toward its worst possible outcomes, even though those outcomes may not have been the most common ones. There is a particular detail worth sitting with here, one that surprises many people encountering this history for the first time. Households that survived an attempted attack, even an unsuccessful one, rarely treated the incident as a private matter to be quietly resolved and forgotten. Quite the opposite. Several surviving accounts describe nobles who deliberately publicized failed attempts against their own lives, spreading word of the incident through their own networks and beyond, rather than concealing it. This seems at first consideration like an unusual response, since publicizing a vulnerability might seem to invite further attempts rather than discourage them. But the underlying logic, once you sit with it, makes a certain grim sense within the values of that era. A noble who survived an attempt and responded with visible decisive justice, a public execution, a display of the captured individual's fate for all to witness, transformed what could have been read as a moment of weakness into a demonstration of strength instead. The message sent was not simply that an attempt had failed, but that this particular household possessed both the vigilance to prevent such attempts and the power to punish anyone who dared try. This raises an interesting question worth considering, one that connects back to something we touched on earlier in this story. Did this deliberate publicity actually deter future attempts, or did it in some perverse way simply raise the stakes and the audacity required of anyone still willing to try? Scholars still debate this particular question, since the evidence allows for reasonable arguments in both directions. Some historians point to periods where a particularly well-publicized failed attempt against a prominent figure appears to correlate with a temporary decrease in similar attempts within that same region, suggesting the deterrent effect was real at least in the short term. Others note that the trade itself never disappeared throughout the medieval period despite these very public consequences, which suggests that whatever deterrent effect existed, it was never strong enough to overcome the desperate circumstances that continued producing new people willing to attempt this work regardless of how visibly previous attempts had ended. What almost certainly did happen following any well-publicized failed attempt was a genuine and lasting shift in how that particular household approached its own security changes that rippled outward to affect households well beyond the one directly involved. Several accounts describe increased scrutiny of household staff following notable failures, more careful verification of labourers hired for temporary work, a general tightening of the informal trust that had previously allowed strangers to move through service roles with relatively little question. This represents in its own quiet way a kind of arms race playing out across generations' methods of infiltration, growing more sophisticated in response to growing caution, which in turn produced still more sophisticated caution in response, an escalating cycle that neither side ever fully won. There is something worth pausing on here, something that connects the specific failures we have examined tonight to the much larger story we have been building across this entire evening together. Every failure, every captured individual, every publicized execution meant to serve as warning ultimately served the interests of the same wealthy households that had in so many cases been the ones commissioning this violence in the first place, whether as the original clients or as the intended targets defending against rival clients elsewhere. The desperate people caught in the middle, The ones who failed and paid the ultimate public price existed within a system that used their failures as much as it had once used their successes, each outcome reinforcing in its own way the same underlying structure of power that had produced the desperation driving people into this trade to begin with. We have spent this evening moving through nearly every corner of this particular history now, from the desperate circumstances that drove people into this work through the improvised education that kept some of them alive long enough to attempt it, through the fragile trust and frequent betrayal defining their relationships with the clients who hired them, through the patient infiltration and precise quiet violence of the act itself, through the long uncertain aftermath of both success and failure alike. What remains as this particular night draws toward its close is not another layer of technique or danger, but something quieter, and in its own way considerably more important, the question of what all of this ultimately meant, what it left behind, and what it might still have to tell us. Resting here together in the dark about the much larger and more universal story of power, desperation, and the people history so often chooses to forget. There is one more account worth setting before you before we let this particular night close, because it does something none of the others quite managed. It does not describe a killing or a betrayal or a failed attempt ending in public spectacle. It describes something smaller, somehow larger at the same time. It comes from a monastery's ledger in the Loire Valley, a record of alms given and travellers sheltered, the kind of dry administrative document historians usually pass over quickly in search of something more dramatic. But tucked among the ordinary entries, a single line notes a donation unusually generous given anonymously by a man who stayed only one night and asked before he left at first light that a candle be kept burning for a week in the memory of a person whose name he would not give. No explanation follows. No further mention of this man appears anywhere else in the ledger or in any other surviving document from that abbey. We do not know who he was. We do not know who the candle was lit for. We only know that somewhere in the folds of this brutal secretive trade, we have spent an entire evening walking through together. A single unnamed person paused long enough to grieve something or someone in the only quiet, private way available to a life built entirely on erasing itself. That fragment has stayed with me longer than almost anything else we have gathered tonight, and I think it stays because it refuses to let this story remain only a story about violence. Everything we have walked through together, the desperate soldiers and fleeing servants who found themselves with no path forward except this one, the improvised weapons and the unmeasured poisons, the weeks of patient, careful infiltration into households that never once suspected the laundress or the stable hand moving quietly among them, the betrayals that came so reliably from the very people who had promised payment, the public execution staged not for justice but for spectacle, the strange mercy of superstition that occasionally let a guilty person hide behind a frightened community's belief in something supernatural. All of it, every layer we have uncovered, was built on top of something achingly ordinary. People doing what people have always done when the world leaves them no other door. Finding a way to survive even when survival demanded something terrible of them. We began this evening with a man crouched behind a low stone wall counting a guard's footsteps in the dark, waiting for a half second that might buy him everything or cost him his life. We have followed people very much like him across an entire continent and several centuries now, through castles and market towns, through court records written in languages few of us will ever read, through the gaps in that record, where entire lives simply vanish without explanation. And if there is a single thread holding all of it together, it is this. Power throughout this history rarely did its own violence. It commissioned it, and then it stepped back safely inside walls of stone and title and reputation, while someone with nothing left to lose carried the actual weight and the actual risk and very often the actual blame alone. This is not a pattern unique to the medieval world, though we have examined it there in unusually sharp detail tonight. It is, if you sit with it honestly, one of the oldest and most persistent patterns in human history, the way those with power find hands willing or desperate enough to do what they themselves would never risk doing directly, and the way history so often remembers the name of the powerful while letting the hand itself dissolve into anonymity, into an unmarked grave, into a single line in a ledger that tells us nothing except that someone once mourned someone else quietly and then disappeared. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that so many of these people, whatever violence they carried out, however desperate or damaged the choices that led them there, remained capable of grief, capable of loyalty, even in a trade that punished loyalty as a liability, capable of pausing on a single ordinary night in a monastery guest house to ask that a candle be lit for someone whose name they would not risk speaking aloud even to a stranger who would never see them again. That detail does not excuse anything these people did. It simply insists quietly that they remained human throughout all of it, that desperation and violence never fully erased whatever softness had existed in them before circumstances forced their hand. And perhaps that is the deepest truth this particular history has to offer, one that reaches well beyond hired killers and medieval households and candle-lit monasteries. Every era produces its own version of people asked to carry weight they never chose, weight created by others who remain comfortable and protected, while someone else absorbs the actual cost. Every era produces its own quiet erasures, names, lost lives reduced to a single fragmentary line in someone else's record, entire interior worlds of grief and fear and small private tenderness that will never be fully known to anyone who comes after. We have spent tonight with people from 800 years ago, but the shape of what we found in their story, desperation meeting power, ordinary people absorbing extraordinary risk, memory, failing to preserve the very people who deserve to be remembered, most honestly, none of that belongs only to the medieval world. It belongs to every century, including our own. History does not close its books neatly. It rarely offers the tidy resolution that stories are supposed to have. Most of the people we have followed tonight never received justice in any form we would recognize as fair. Most of them left behind no name, no grave anyone could visit, no family able to speak honestly about what they had actually done or why. The powerful who commissioned their work mostly walked away untouched, remembered, if remembered at all, in family trees and church donations rather than in any accounting of what their comfort had actually cost someone else. That is simply what the evidence shows us, and Life Was Brutal has never been in the business of softening what the evidence actually says. But brutal is not the same as meaningless, and here at the very end of a long night together, that distinction matters more than anything else we've discussed, because something did survive, not names mostly, not faces or voices or the particular sound a person's footsteps made against medieval stone. What survived was the pattern itself, faint but unmistakable, running through every fragment of court record and chronicler's aside we have gathered tonight. The pattern of ordinary people finding even inside the darkest circumstances some small remaining space for grief, for care, for a single act of private tenderness that asked nothing in return and expected no audience at all. That candle burning quietly for a week in a monastery no one remembers the name of for a person no one can now identify, lit by a man who left before dawn and never returned. It burned anyway. It burned for someone who mattered to at least one person in the entire world, even if the rest of the world never knew why. Let that be what stays with you tonight, more than the weapons, more than the betrayals, more than the execution staged for a frightened crowd. Somewhere in a century that has been gone a very long time, a single flame kept burning in the dark, for someone whose name we will never know, lit by someone whose name we will never know either. And for one quiet week in one small stone room that was enough,